Good morning. Good. My name is Eddie Glaw, Jr., and I'm the chair of the Center for African American Studies here at Princeton. On behalf of the faculty and the administration, we welcome you to Princeton University and to what we hope will be an extraordinary conversation. The Center for African American Studies likes to think of itself as an intelligent convener, an institution that can make possible conversations that impact the way we address some of the most pressing issues facing the nation. A place where scholars and policy wonks, artists and grassroots organizers can come together to reflect seriously about important matters and give direction to how we might mobilize to address them. There is a triple crisis that confronts Black America today. We are aware of the problem of urban education, where generations of Black children are educated in inferior schools, where we currently find ourselves awash in political banter about the quality of American education that is more concerned about scapegoating teachers than ensuring that our children are educated properly. More interested in market solutions to a public good than our nation's future. We know we have a problem of unemployment. Decades upon decades of double-digit unemployment in Black communities. And now we're suffering terribly during this economic crisis. But the challenge extends beyond the question of jobs, but to a broader concern about a living wage. Too many people in this country want to work, are working hard every day, but can't make ends meet. They have to choose between paying the rent and putting food on the table. And there's a callous conversation about their efforts. And then, of course, there is the crisis of mass incarceration. America has become a carceral state, putting behind bars populations that are seen by so many as simply disposable. We've witnessed over the last 30 years our prison population increase from 300,000 to over 2 million. Prisons have become big business. Profits are made at the expense of people. And groups of Black and brown men and women and poor Americans of all colors find themselves locked on the underside of American life. We've gathered today to reflect on this issue, to understand its contours, to grasp the implication of what can only be described as a moral crisis with political and social consequences for our nation's future. This event stands as one of the largest one-day conferences hosted in the history of Princeton University. And the fact that its subject is about prisons and race speaks volumes, yes? Y'all better talk back to me. Right? You're at Princeton, but talk back to me. Right? It is a university-wide event, co-sponsored by academic units across the campus and student organizations across the campus. You know, by looking at your programs, we have 2 panel discussions for today, a film screening and a keynote conversation between the one and only Dr. Cornel West and the extraordinary Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow. Scholars have joined us from across the nation. You can take a look at their biographies in your programs. Over 700 people have registered to attend this conversation. People from all over the country, from New York to California, from Tennessee to Ohio. Cohorts of students from Amherst College, Temple University, Rutgers, and Rowan have made their way to Makash 10. And those who could not make it, who could not come to Princeton, join us via webcast. I'm thinking of folks like Patsy Alexander and Hollis Jenkins who are watching right now from New York, taking advantage of all of the platforms that allow us to invite so many others to join us in this conversation. Now, all of this began, and I see Jen telling me to hurry up. All of this began as an idea in the mind and heart of one of our students. Brandon Bell came to the staff of Cass and expressed his profound desire to take up the issue of prisons and race. He wanted to have a conversation to call attention to the crisis that has engulfed so many communities throughout America. Brandon's passion was infectious, and through his hard work, along with the tireless efforts of our events coordinator, Jennifer Losey. If you see Jennifer, just say thank you, because this event wouldn't be possible without her. And our associate director, Nolewe Rooks, who's right here. The Imprisonment of a Race was conceived. I also want to thank all of our student interns, April Peters and Carla Haley Penn, who are out there making this event possible as well. But the passion of a student is one of the reasons why we have gathered here today. And it is my pleasure to introduce him to you. Brother Brandon Bell comes to us from Inglewood, California. He is a senior in the molecular biology department here at Princeton. After graduation, he plans to attend medical school to become a pediatric surgeon. Outside of the classroom, Brandon is an emergency medical technician with the Princeton First Aid and Rescue Squad. He's a practitioner, yes? And a member of the Black Arts Company, the drama group on our campus. He likes to write and perform his original poetry, using his writing as a device with which to confront a variety of social issues and personal concerns. It is clear to all who meet Brother Brandon that he is passionate about justice, passionate about those who have been relegated to the margins, to those who aren't readily seen by those of us who live in privilege. He feels that while medicine is indeed his calling, it is not the only way he wishes to serve his community. He hopes that this conference will be the first of many contributions towards raising awareness of issues of race in this country. He is a young soldier on this battlefield, and I'm delighted to welcome this soldier to the stage, Brandon Bell.
Thank you, Professor Glaude, for that amazing introduction. I was a 15-year-old high school sophomore, the first and only time I ever had a gun drawn on me. In fact, there were about 8 of them. But these guns didn't belong to who you might think they did. These weren't the guns of your typical group of hoodlums or gang, but those of the infamous Inglewood, California Police Department. It was a case of mistaken identity that was my own personal introduction into racial profiling, and an issue that has plagued my community since well before my existence. Now, enraged, terrified, and without the slightest apology, I began to wonder how something such as this could happen to me, especially now when we've come so far from the racist times of civil rights and Rodney King. Then I began to wonder, have we come as far as I've been taught to believe? It was official. Medicine and sciences would no longer be my only passions as I move forward with my academic career. Fast forward to June 2007, I was a high school graduate en route to Princeton University. But more specifically, I was a black male from South Central Los Angeles going to the #1 school in the nation. Now, representing a meager 8.6% of the total campus population, the black students of Princeton University seemed to be an elite group. But rather than celebrate my acceptance into this venerated group, I began to wonder, where was everybody else? I soon discovered that many of my fellow black men were matriculating into another group of institutions, one that was much easier to get into, yet significantly harder to get out of. These institutions, of course, belong to the great American prison system. Home to 2.3 Americans in 2009, it represents the largest in the world. And of these 2.3 million, 38%, or 877,000, were black. So why is it that although we represent a meager 12.4% of the total U.S. population, we made up nearly 40% of the total prison population, a figure that has steadily been increasing? In contrast, the percentage of blacks in elite higher education is on the decline. A professor at University of Michigan named Michael Bastido found that although overall college-going rates for blacks are on the rise, they've been accompanied by parallel increase in admission standards, which in turn locks them out of the top colleges. As a result, they are forced to seek what some might seem to be a lower quality of education, one that ultimately makes them less competitive in the graduate world. This is seen, for example, here at Princeton, where the percentage of blacks was 8.6 in 2007, however, has since dropped to 7.5. This leads me to the reason we're all here today. My growing passion for civil rights would introduce me to the likes of Mumia Abu-Jamal, a political prisoner on death row who's been awaiting his day of justice for 30 years. The more I learned about his and the cases of other political prisoners of the 70s and 80s, the more I began to realize that the things that they were fighting for, the things that they died for, the things that they were currently in prison for, are the very issues still plaguing us today. Then I thought to myself, Huey Newton was 24 years old when he co-founded the Black Panther Party. Stokely Carmichael was 20 years old when he started working for SNCC. And Fred Hampton was 21 years old when he was murdered, fighting to get me where I am today. Then here I was, almost 21 years old. What was I doing to fight for the struggle that I had become so passionate about? And this was the epiphany that sent me into the offices of Professors Eddie Glaude and Cornel West. I told them that my vision was to educate the Princeton University community and to bring to the forefront an issue that is not discussed enough amongst us students: the historic mass incarceration effort destroying the nation's black communities. I was soon introduced to Jennifer Leslie and Professor Noliwe Rooks in the Center for African American Studies, and the planning quickly got underway. Immediately, as we bounced ideas off of each other, I saw my small dream turn into a huge reality. Within a couple of months, we had a list of esteemed panelists, 2 legendary keynote speakers, and a schedule of events that trumped my initial vision, which was a room with a couple chairs and maybe 1 or 2 guest speakers. With the strong support of a slew of university departments, student groups, and the department's intern, Danielle Ping, the conference quickly grew larger than Princeton University itself, reaching a significance that I could have never anticipated. As soon as the website opened, we saw registrations come in from all across the nation. Its success for me is indicative of the detrimental significance that the imprisonment issue holds, and our acknowledgement of the fact that we must solve this problem immediately in order to heal our communities. Today, with hundreds of people in attendance, a worldwide webcast, and a screening at my alma mater, King Drew Magnet High School in Los Angeles, this is one of the biggest conferences Princeton University has held to date. This conference would not have been possible without the generous financial contributions of a number of departments and student groups, which include, bear with me, the Black Men's Awareness Group, the Black Student Union, the Carl A. Field Center, the Department of History, the NAACP, the Pace Center, the Princeton Association of Black Women, the National Society of Black Engineers, the Princeton Caribbean Connection, Program in American Studies, Program in Gender and Sexuality Studies, the University Center for Human Values, and last but not least, the Woodrow Wilson School. And with that being said, without further ado, let's get things underway. I would like to welcome moderator of our first panel, Dr. Sarah Haley, as well as our panelists, Professors Caleb Smith, Joy A. James, Lynn Washington, Heather Ann Thompson, and Khalil Gibran Mohammed to the stage. Thank you, and I hope that this conference will educate and enlighten you.
Good morning. Welcome to our first panel on histories of punishment and political prisoners, histories of what scholar Dylan Rodriguez calls radical prison praxis, with a particular focus on the 1970s. We have 5 distinguished panelists today, and we want to be sure to have enough time for full discussion after our speakers' presentations. So each speaker will have 10 minutes to present, and we'll sort of be keeping a close watch on time. Afterwards, we'll have a Q&A session, and please note that there will be microphones being passed around for Q&A, so if you have a comment or question, please be sure to look for them. In the interest of time, I'm going to forego the traditional lengthy introductions and just briefly introduce each of our panelists so we can get right into the panel. Also note that we are expecting a call from Mumia Abu Jamal, a very important call, so we may have to interrupt a presentation or the panel at some point if that comes in, but I can't think of any better reason to do that than to hear from him. So I will briefly introduce our speakers in the order of their presentation. Lynn Washington is a journalist for the Philadelphia Tribune and associate professor of journalism at Temple University. Joy James is professor of humanities at Williams College and a visiting scholar of African and African diaspora studies at the University of Texas, Austin. Caleb Smith is associate professor of English at Yale University. Heather Ann Thompson is associate professor of history and African American Studies at Temple University, and Khalil Gibran Muhammad is assistant professor of American history at Indiana University. He's also the associate editor of the Journal of American History.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry for the little technical difficulty. My name is Lynn Washington. I teach at Temple University. I've written about these issues that we're discussing today for longer than I've had gray hair. In America, we have this notion that bad things happen every place else. We easily would be able to understand that bad things would happen in a place like Soweto, or more specifically, in a place like South Africa, but we're the greatest democracy on earth, and we don't do those kind of bad things. But the reality is that we do, and the fact that we deny what we do is the reason why we're here today. In 1951, a group of Americans, primarily African Americans, but also other progressives, sent a petition to the United Nations charging genocide. Fascinating, extraordinary document, but it had some elements discussing what we're here to discuss today, and that is the fundamental unfairness of our criminal justice system. This is not new. This goes back to the very founding of our country. We're here in a state, New Jersey, where racial profiling took on a whole different cast. And when you go back into the annals of the Supreme Court of New Jersey, you will find a decision in the 1820s where they indicated that it was the policy of the court to presume that every Negro that appeared before that court was a slave until they proved themselves different. And when we look at the underlying aspects of racial profiling, it is that presumption of guilt until you prove yourself innocent, which turns American justice, or the allegation of American justice, on its head. In Pennsylvania, we have a small problem. We have a prison population that's busting at the seams. They're now building 3 more new prisons in Pennsylvania. That's on top of the 9 new prisons that were built in the 1990s. And as you see, the, I would say, exponential expansion of the prison population, as well as the number of facilities that we have. And a really damning statistic, as far as I'm concerned, is this last one: the amount of money that we spent incarcerating people in Pennsylvania versus what it would cost to send someone to Penn State University. We have Mumia on the line. I will yield my time to Mumia.
Mumia, we are actually going to, you're live now, and we're going to hold the phone up to the microphone so that you can speak to the audience.
On the move. Dear friends, activists, scholars, colleagues. On the move. Thank you for your invitation to join you.
Okay, wait, hang on 1 second, Mumia. This isn't my phone. Mumia?
Yes. Apparently it is. On the move. Dear friends, activists, scholars, and colleagues. Thank you for your invitation to join you and to participate in this conference. It's an honor to share these brief moments with you. A nod and a salute to your panelists, many of whom I know admire. Your topic is, to say the least, a daunting one. For the sheer numbers are breathtaking, especially when we consider its familial, social, communal, and political impacts. I dare say, for those among you who are African American, no matter your class or income, you won't have to think very long to recall a nephew, and far too often a niece, not to mention a son or daughter, who, if not presently a prisoner, is then an ex-prisoner of some county, state, or federal system. That speaks to the ubiquity of the problem of the vast numbers of men, women, and even juveniles who populate the prison industrial complex here in America. As many of you know, the U.S., with barely 5% of the world's population, imprisons 25% of the world's prisoners. As Michelle Alexander, whom many of you will hear from in this conference's evening program, has noted, the numbers of imprisoned blacks here rivals and exceeds South Africa's hated apartheid system during its height. We shouldn't take this analogy lightly, for South African apartheid was the epitome of the racist police state, second only to Nazi Germany in its repellent nature. Moreover, much of its energy was consumed in a de facto war, or at the very least, military espionage jargon, a low-intensity conflict with a black majority that was criminalized in almost every feature of African independent life, restricting places to live, work, study, and even love. This speaks to how blind we are in this country to the scope of the problem, much less its resolution, and how it has been normalized in social and political consciousness, in part because the corporate media neglects or slants such a story. For if they can fail in reportage leading to a hot war, here I mean Iraq, they certainly can fail in reporting the parameters of a low-intensity conflict that crushes black lives. Perhaps the words of a non-American, I hesitate to call him a foreigner, but long an observer of this country, can give us some insight. At 71 years, South Africa's great musical gift, Hugh Masekela, gave an interview recently in which he made note of the post-apartheid South Africa. He said, the majority of the population only got the right to vote and a lack of harassment from the police. But any further changes will be bad for business. Same like here in the United States. The fruits of the civil rights movement are very minimal, he said. Now, I quote Masekela here, not merely because of his celebrity, nor because I love his music, but because he, like millions of Africans, lived under the madness of apartheid, even though he escaped it by later moving abroad, and therefore knows it intimately. He therefore is able to recognize its elements in American life. But why is apartheid seen as so repellent and the U.S. prison industrial complex seen as so benign? I think the answer is twofold. One, the
call is from the State Correctional Institution at Green and is subject to monitoring and recording.
One, the political elites of both political parties here reached bipartisan consensus on this issue. And two, the presence of black political actors in various offices act as a shield repelling attacks on the racist nature of the system. As in South Africa, black political elites have benefited from an economic system that is profoundly unfair to the vast majority of African people, especially the poor working class. Thus, race protects a class divide, and despite its imagery, social inequality. In essence, the post-apartheid regime achieved a result that the apartheid era tried to but failed to construct: a buffer class that protected the lands, property, and material wealth of the white minority settler regime. It is one of the ironies of history that the government led by the African National Congress would achieve this result, albeit by a negotiated settlement. So let us depart from theoretical political constructs to note an example of the real. Several months ago, a police squad raided a black working class home, shot into it from outside, and killed a black child. That in itself, unfortunately, can't be called noteworthy. Yet it has a certain resonance when we note that both the mayor of the city and its police chief were black. Those aware of this incident may recognize the name of the beautiful child involved, Ayanna Jones, I believe, of the city, Detroit. Surely this provides some insight into the political function of black leaders and their impotence when it comes to curbing state action that endangers black poor life. One of your keynoters, law professor Alexander, addresses some of these points in her book, but what had the most salience for me was something that I've not seen in any of the reviews I've read. Understanding that as most prisoners don't have computer access, I probably missed scads of reviews. It was her observation that the black working class and poor constitute a caste position in U.S. society. In a nation that promotes democracy, one would think the charge that a distinct racial caste exists at the heart of it would provoke controversy. Now, judging from what I've read, this central point has been glossed over. As I close, I of course commend her book to all of you for study, but I must do more. We must call for, agitate for, and if all else fails, create a new popular movement that struggles to break this caste system once and for all. Indeed, it is in all of our collective interest to do so. For most black scholars, intellectuals, academics, and political elites are one generation removed, if that, from the ghettos of distant memory. With the collapse of the U.S. economy, where do you think the cuts will occur, and the welfare state, and the state itself shrinks? Finally, we know that the impact of felon disenfranchisement laws led almost inexorably to the election of George W. Bush in 2000. Think of what the world may have looked like if that political event didn't happen. So it's in the interest of us all. I thank you all. On the move. From death row, this is Mumia Jamal.
Mumia, would you be open to questions from the audience? Okay. Mumia has time, a few minutes for some questions. Does anybody in the audience have a question for him? You've left the audience speechless. Okay, yes. Oh, well, we want to send you our love from the audience. Okay, we do have a question from a young gentleman, I believe from a youth group.
Thank you for your comments, and it's very inspiring. I just have a question. Since you use an international example to show how caste systems work and are kept in place, is there
Sorry, it's somebody else's phone.
is there any examples where those caste systems have been broken and working class oppressed peoples have been able to be enfranchised into mainstream society?
Mumia, did you hear that question? Hello? He's gone. It was a great question.
And while it may appear that Mumia and I were coordinating things, I mean, we worked together back in the 70s, and we started in broadcast journalism together back at WRTI. There was no coordination. I mean, there's no 1-800 Mumia number, so I didn't call him last night and say, yo, my man. What you saw in Pennsylvania is replicated all across the country. I just picked California randomly, but you see the same exponential rise in inmates. You also see the diminution of the value of education. In California, the teacher salaries are about the average, highest in the nation. The average teacher in California makes about $59,000 a year, nice salary. The average prison guard makes $73,000, and that's before overtime. We have our priorities all screwed up in the United States. Again, this petition, 1951, addressed this very issue. And in our state, or in my state of Pennsylvania, or the state that I work, because I live here under Christie, we'll leave that to question and answer period. Our governor, who sees Christie as his role model, is whacking the heck out of education, but increasing the monies for the prison system, as well as probation and parole and the state police and the judiciary, and not the legislature. Mumia, we all know about him and his struggle. He is one of the political prisoners in the United States, although Amnesty does not officially recognize him as a political prisoner. What has happened to him since he has been incarcerated fits that definition to a T, as it did another Philadelphian named Mario Baddelli, who was the president of the Republic of New Africa and a victim of COINTELPRO long after the FBI told Congress in 1972 that it was all over. The case against Mumia is very simple. 3 elements: eyewitness testimony, testimony of an alleged confession, and gun recovery at the scene. He had a weapon on him, and they said that that was the one that did it. Eyewitnesses, very shaky. Both of them were in problems with the police. One guy was on probation for throwing a firebomb in a school, driving a cab without a driver's license, but of course he's not subject to any kind of coercion from the police. The other was a prostitute, 38 arrests, a number outstanding. The confession, Mumia was in a hospital dying with blood all in his lungs. He allegedly yelled out, "I shot thee, mother, will you fill that in? And I hope he dies." The only 2 people who heard it forgot that they heard it for 2 months, and those are police officers. Confessions are important to 2 occupations, at least, priests and police. And these mugs forgot it. And then the gun. As you can see, anybody here a ballistician? Anybody here a ballistics expert? No? It doesn't matter. Take a look at that. You can see that a .44 caliber Magnum on your right, my left, is much larger than a .38 Special Plus P, which is the other one. The medical examiner said that the .44 was what he recovered from the slain officer. That document and documentation was withheld from the jury and it was also withheld from the defense for 12 years. Does that undermine a fair trial? Absolutely, unequivocally. But it goes a little further. That's me there, and I swore I would never take a picture of myself with a gun in my hand after Lee Harvey Oswald, but to show what happened with the Mumia case. They claimed that Abu Jamal stood over the slain officer, shot 4 times, missing 3 times, only hitting once. So if you're shooting 4 times and there was no testimony that he shot up in the air, there should be bullet holes in the sidewalk. You cannot shoot a bullet into a sidewalk without making holes. Prosecution claims it. Supreme Court said it's okay. Supreme Court of Pennsylvania and the United States. But when we shot into the sidewalk, every type of ammunition that we used, every type of ammunition that the police said was there, made holes. The 155 grain is the kind that the police had. That makes a splotch. The copper-jacketed bullet and the plus P bullet digs out the concrete. So the evidence that has placed this man in prison on death row for over 30 years. My kids were little kids when Mumia went into jail. Now my kids are graduated from college. One has a master's, one has a doctorate, and both have kids. I'm in the pop-pop stage, and that's cool. And the travesty here is that all of the problems that you know about that particular case, the courts say, no problem. Even the fact that the trial judge said that he's going to help the prosecution fry the nigger. And one judge said, well, that's no problem because it was a jury trial. Yeah, but it was a trial where the judge picked part of the jury and determined what evidence the jury would hear. And also, the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, when it got the case, it said, well, listen, we've already dealt with the issue of bias. Yeah, you dealt with the issue of prosecution bias, not race bias. What you see in the courts is the most outrageous aspect of the Abu Jamal case, and I'll step aside from here. Thank you very much.
Good morning, and thank you to the organizers of this event. Also, thank you very much to Brandon. It's an honor to hear your address and welcome, as well as an honor to hear from Mumia Abu-Jamal. So what I wanted to talk about this morning is women in revolutionary struggle and escaping the museum effect. And Jennifer, I just want to make sure, do I just press this for this to continue? Okay, I might need you to come up. Doesn't seem to be working for me in the moment. So there are a couple of things that we were talking about in organizing for an event at UT Austin for next month on Black political imprisonment here and now. And there were 2 of my colleagues I've been working with, Joao Costa Vargas and Frank Wilderson, who's at UC Irvine. They raised several questions. Okay. They raised several questions which have kind of haunted me over the last couple of weeks thinking about this presentation. The first is, what is the museum effect or the museum approach to talking about political imprisonment in the United States? Meaning that we talk about it as historical artifact, that it's something that has a container in it, that has a specific time of origin, a specific time of events of struggle and trauma, and then a closure. And the second was from Frank Wolderson, was why doesn't anybody ever talk about the MOVE women? And that led me to think about the need for a cult of respectability around the rebel, right? That the rebel has to be a political phenomenon or figure that we find embraceable. So I needed to expand my timeline. I won't expand my 10 minutes, but my timeline in thinking about this to talk about what preceded the women who were incarcerated during the 1970s. My framework, I was told, was 1970s and 1980s, right? And what comes after it. So the generation before, which I'll start with 1955, Claudette Colvin, who is 15, who becomes pregnant, who is not considered, even though she refused to give up her seat 9 months before Rosa Parks, credible because she does not fit that cult of respectability. To Rosa Parks, who, if we study Jean Theo Harris's text, Want to Start a Revolution anthology, if we look at that chapter, was actually a radical but becomes something else when President Clinton provides her with the Congressional Gold Medal. On through the women who are influenced by these events, who are growing up, who are aware of these events, right? So the most well-known would be Angela Davis, then Assata Shakur, and on into the MOVE women to try to address Frank's query, why doesn't anybody ever talk about the MOVE women, which is part of my own failings as well. When we did the anthology Imprisoned Intellectuals, it covered a range of activists from the 1960s, 1970s, but I never thought to invite a MOVE woman, Ramona Africata Brown, when we held the conference, and I never thought to include the writings of MOVE women into the anthology. So somehow, even when I'm being outside of the respectable zone, I still try to recreate it. So in looking at those two issues posed by my colleagues, right? Why the museum, why the need for the museum, why the need to contain political struggle, why the need to align oneself only with the respectable rebel who mirrors back a middle-class aesthetic that we find embraceable, brings me to two more things to consider. One specifically around the black female body and her white revolutionary allies, you'll see Marilyn Buck up here, eventually here, is what is it about black female labor and revolutionary struggle in which productivity and reproduction are central and are not found tied to the male body? And the last becomes escaping the museum, how activism holds a possible avenue for an escape route. And I find that this conference itself is a form of escape, not into a fantasy in which we ignore the existence, but also an escape not to be trapped. Do you think that's Mumia? No, okay, so I'll keep talking. To be trapped by constrictors. Okay, so the museum effect, right? The museum effect is countered in part by expanding our sense of a timeline. That if we go back to the civil rights movement, which led to the black liberation movement, the black power movement, right? That we find embedded there forms of radicalism that reproduce themselves in the women who become the icons of struggle in the 1970s specifically, but also extension to the 1980s. So that Angela Davis, growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, when you read her memoir, talks about it as Bombingham. And interestingly, Condoleezza Rice says the same thing in her memoir, even though these women are diametrically opposed on the political spectrum, right? That one of the things that happens in studying Davis and writing about Davis is that to understand her, you have to understand these radical elements of the civil rights movement and also the women who preceded. I mentioned Rosa Parks, about her radicalism that's found now in academic texts. We could also talk about Ella Baker, who's fired from the NAACP when she goes to organize in Florida with African Americans who are trying to resist violence, and she asks them, what do you need? And they don't go first to the right to vote, they say self-defense, we need guns, right? So she engages in sort of working with the grassroots that is not protected specifically by class or alignment with affluent whites, and that leads her to being ousted from a respectable middle-class formation. We could tie on from Davis's rootedness in the civil rights movement, her aesthetic, her struggle that comes from that, her family's understanding of self-defense to the right to have guns in the home because of the bombings of black homes when they're integrating Birmingham, Alabama, and kind of see the linkages of how Davis becomes who she is. Not only the first assistant professor in philosophy at UCLA, but also someone who witnesses violence and has an understanding for self-defense, and so requires bodyguards. And those bodyguards include a 17-year-old Jonathan Jackson, who takes guns that are registered in her name and attempts to bring attention, right, to what is going on with the Soledad brothers with incarceration in California, and in the tragedy that ensues with the death of the high school senior, with the crippling of the presiding judge, the DA that's taking hostage, right? And the deaths and the tragedy that ensued that come only from the California guards who have a mandate when Jonathan brings guns into a Marin County courthouse and they attempt to make a political statement, goes out into the van, the guards fire on the van. The deaths that ensue come only from the state. But Angela Davis is charged with murder, basically, and then is incarcerated. And then Davis becomes, through her association with political rebels, again, male bodies, Jonathan Jackson, George Jackson, his older brother who's incarcerated, and who his death by prison guards will spark the Attica Rebellion in 1971, becomes this political icon that we know something about. Now, Davis, though, also becomes the museum herself, because as we approach, the texts, and they're very important texts, and also our activism. I mean, as a political theorist, I critique a lot, but I'm also very appreciative, right? And so that critical resistance created a context for the academy to even talk about incarceration. Again, it creates a containment for it and calls it incarceration studies or prison studies, whatever. But that Davis moved from being a political prisoner to being exonerated to surviving FBI COINTELPRO, right? Whereas men did not, Jonathan Jackson did not, George Jackson did not, but still the museum appears to encase her and in some ways sever her from political rebellion that she was associated with. I want to also point out that there's a difference between political protest and revolutionary struggle. So I'm not saying that all the women are uniformly revolutionary, but I'm saying their alignment with the frontline sector, which is the carceral state, and murderous mandates that come from the government, whether it's, as Brandon mentioned, Fred Hampton and Mark Clark's assassination in 1969. You would have seen Deborah Johnson, his surviving partner, and her pregnant state when she's arrested at the night of early morning, December 4th in Chicago. Whether it's the murderous mandate through joint ventures with the FBI and the local police, or it's just the mandate of slow death by indifference and neglect, right? These are things that we confront, but the museum suggests that we should just walk through as a tour rather than to be engaged with it. And even the activists who engage with it then become reified, like placed in these like glass cages for study and not necessarily engagement. So if there's a difference between revolutionary struggle and political protest, then it's absolutely essential that we figure out how to get out of this museum. And so I want to segue through the cult of respectability, which if you compared, and I have in the past, Assata Shakur with Davis and Assata Shakur with MOVE, it's almost like we go on a trajectory away from respectability and what is embraceable in the academy. So I'm moving rapidly to close. I want to close by saying a couple things about why these women are so important. And these are just the images. So obviously there's further study, further discussion, but wanted to share the visuals. And Erica Huggins, the date is wrong. It says 63, but it's 73. Women embody a unique form of rebellion that has to be contained because they have not only the productive capacity to labor, which is tied to the mundane, non-glorious, unglorious, technical, logistical stuff that just reproduces political organizations and struggles. So when you read Assata's memoir, you hear her talking about selling the newspapers, doing the sickle cell testing clinics, doing these mundane aspects, but they also have the reproductive capacity in which their bodies, right? Deborah Johnson's giving birth to Fred Hampton Jr., right? Assata Shakur being impregnated or becoming pregnant during trial and then giving birth later, their bodies reproduce the next generation of black people who can embrace themselves, love themselves, and struggle. And I want to end on this note of reflection of one way of thinking of leaving the museum is to think about the specific contributions of the black female form, that the intent of the state is to obliterate not just your productive capacity to struggle, but your reproductive capacity to create family. And that stems not only to the way in which Assata was encouraged to, quote, abort in prison, or Sophia Bukhari had a forced hysterectomy, something like what happened to Fannie Lou Hamer, but also that we see today from William Bennett, the former Secretary of Education under the Reagan administration, who can say in 2005, without the Catholic Church coming down on him like a ton of bricks, that if you want to stop crime, abort black babies before they're born. And it wasn't a multiracial thing he did. He went specifically black. To these posters that appear across the country, the most dangerous place in the womb is what? The black female, the most dangerous place for a black child is a black mother. And so our escape routes then would have these multiple levels of loving, of resistance and struggle, where the female body would remain center as it always has been.
Okay, thanks very much to the organizers and my fellow panelists and everyone who worked to bring this together, and all of you for being here. I'm really honored to be a part of this event. The title of my remarks is Prison Crisis and the Historical Imagination. In the opening paragraphs of Soul on Ice, Eldridge Cleaver recalls his arrival at Soledad State Prison. I fell in with a group of young blacks who, like myself, were in vociferous rebellion against what we perceived as slavery on a higher plane. The site of the new slavery is the penitentiary, where daily life plays out as an ongoing racialized conflict. More broadly, it's the United States under Jim Crow. Cleaver notes, with his characteristic mixture of bitterness and ironic humor, that he'd been locked up for the first time in 1954, within months of the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education, the landmark of legal desegregation. He locates himself within a struggle that extends from the schoolhouses of Kansas to the prisons of California and beyond, and that did not end in 1865 or 1954. The project of this historical panel, as I understand it, is to recollect an era of vociferous rebellion against the American prison system, perhaps along the way to reflect on the still vital legacy of that era for the present crisis. My own training is in literary and cultural studies, and my research into the myriad contested legacies of the American prison has been oriented towards a much longer history, one that extends back through the prison farms of the early 20th century to the plantations, penitentiaries, and reservations that organized life in the United States around structures of captivity from the beginning. What I have to say about the period between about 1968 and 1981, then, is mainly concerned with how a generation of writers understood their own deep history. We might consider the long 1970s not only as the historical period that includes such earth-shaking events as the Attica Uprising, but also as an epoch in which men and women transformed American history by developing distinctive modes of thinking and speaking about the past. The ways of grasping the history of captivity, of remaking it in a context of struggle, is itself a vital part of their legacy. The point I wish to make is pretty simple, maybe not even very controversial, and to those of you with longer memories than mine, there may be no news here. The point is that around the 1970s, a history that had been mainly written as one of marginality and dependency, when it was written at all, was reimagined as a heritage of conflict, collective struggle, and self-assertion. Of course, this heritage was not conjured out of thin air. It was to be found in archives and traditions of various kinds. More than a century earlier, the ex-slave Harriet Jacobs had insisted on the peculiar kinds of knowledge that belonged to those who had endured captivity and dispossession. Only by experience, Jacobs wrote, can anyone realize how deep and dark and foul is that pit of abominations. In the first half of the 20th century, too, there were many efforts to rewrite American history from the point of view of its captives. We might think of the pioneering scholarship of Hurston or Du Bois, of an archivist and curator like Arturo Alonso Schomburg, or of periodicals like the Chicago Defender, of the informal historical memory passed down in stories and music and habits of being. In the years after 1965, though, with the rise of the tradition that we've come to call prison literature, the voices of the captives began to speak with a fierce new eloquence. In works of poetry and prose, prison writers refashioned the past from the perspective of their own situation of crisis. As I worked on the prison and the American imagination, I spent time, for example, with the Acoma Pueblo poet Simon Ortiz, who introduced himself to readers as the voice of a people who had been made to disappear and had no history. Confined in the U.S. Army Psychiatric Hospital at Fort Lyon, Colorado, Ortiz composed a book of poems that memorialized the massacre of Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians committed by U.S. soldiers that had ridden out from the very same fort in 1864. Remember Sand Creek, Ortiz commanded, and went on to remember as well those who had fought the expansion of U.S. control across the western frontier. The Chicano writer Jimmy Santiago Baca, locked away in the Arizona State Prison in Florence, a dehumanizing environment, he called it, designed to destroy me, composed Immigrants in Our Own Land, linking his own life story to the long history of conflict between U.S. power and Hispanic communities in the Southwest and northern Mexico. George Jackson's prison letters depicted incarceration in terms that recalled what Orlando Patterson would refer to as the social death of enslavement. Captivity is the closest thing to death that one is likely to experience in this life. Jackson told a story of his personal transformation in Soledad and San Quentin, where he improvised a discipline of study and training for militant action. Quote, "This monster they've engendered in me will return to torment its maker." Jackson, like Malcolm X and Eldridge Cleaver, described his own rebirth into a minority community that could help to preserve the self against the mortifying violence of the prison. The community was held together, at least in part, by a common sense of the collective past. Soul on Ice included long, admiring passages on Frederick Douglass, and everywhere the specter of enslavement haunted prison literature. As Etheridge Knight wrote of his time in an Indiana penitentiary, the fears of years, like a biting whip, had cut deep, bloody grooves across our backs. Some of these writers found large reading publics, and around the same time, their way of thinking about the histories of imprisonment and race was brought to bear with new force on the traditional institutions of knowledge. To cite just a few examples, maybe this is the museum, to cite just a few examples that have shaped my own work, this was the era of Angela Davis's essays on Frederick Douglass, which made explicit connections to the prisons of the present. Herbert Apthecker's study of Nat Turner's slave rebellion, which recovered an icon of black militancy. New Jersey's own H. Bruce Franklin, who published The Victim as Criminal and Artist in 1978, and many others. What I wish to recall about this broad-based, multifaceted effort to reimagine the American past is that it forged a strong bond between two specific projects of institutional reform. On one hand, the dismantling of an unjust, inhumane penal system. On the other, the desegregation of the education system from the primary schools through the universities. From the beginning, desegregation was both a social and an intellectual task. It involved not only diversifying the schools, but also enlarging the field of legitimate knowledge of what counts as history and culture. The project of educational reform was and is a struggle, but a number of significant gains were made in the late 1960s and 1970s, especially perhaps at the university level. I might mention the student movements that led to the founding of the ethnic studies programs at my alma mater, UC Berkeley. Here at Princeton, the program in African American Studies was formally established in 1969. Its mission, according to a faculty committee, was to study the history, the culture, and the current situation of 25 million Americans of African origins In other words, to regard the past while keeping one eye on the present. The difficult, incomplete integration of the schools and the establishment of such programs made possible research and teaching that would have been almost inconceivable a generation earlier. Some ideas that had seemed subversive in the late 1960s had become academic articles of faith by the time I went to Berkeley in the 1990s. At the same time, though, the prison crisis was only getting worse. Legal scholars referred to the decline of the rehabilitative ideal and the resurgence of a more vengeful penal regime. Soon, the U.S. had produced the largest carceral system on the planet, a sprawling apparatus of captivity and dispossession, which has been analyzed by Michelle Alexander as the new Jim Crow, and which, as Ruthie Gilmore and Loic Wakan have shown, serves as a neoliberal state's substitute for the abandoned institutions of social welfare. Here's a double movement. In the universities, a set of precarious but major and enduring transformations. In the prisons, the erosion of even the most basic legal safeguards and rehabilitative programs. An effect of these two transformations has sometimes been felt as the painful estrangement of research from activism, theory from practice, the classroom from the prison cell. There are still substantial collaborations across these lines, but there's also the strong suspicion among some that the academic critique of power has lost touch with the struggle. If the reform of the universities ever did tempt any of us into a sense of complacency, though, we are waking up from it now. In the University of California system, in Wisconsin and Ohio, and almost everywhere else, the same political and economic project that created the world's most expensive prison system is now renewing its assault on education. The economic crisis serves as the occasion for these emergency measures, but the pluralist programs in the critical humanities established around the 1970s have been identified as some of the first targets. What we confront is a reactionary turn that would resegregate the system of education along the old lines of race and class. It is with these conflicts in mind that we might regard the 1970s from here, in one of the country's monuments of higher learning. What comes into view is a constellation of critical practices across the ferment of multiple institutions. Looked at from the perspective of the present, this constellation might take the shape of a circle. It might take the shape of a fist.
This is the forwarding the mechanism. And then just like that to fast forward. Okay, put your screen on for you. Okay. Good morning. I am very, very honored to be here today. As a scholar of African American and activist history, I am really persuaded that today's discussion is one we all need to have, and that is a discussion that tries to understand the connections between the decade of the 70s, when America's prisoners so dramatically challenged the nation's carceral assumptions and practices, and the present day, a historically unprecedented and internationally unparalleled carceral crisis for the poor in general and the Black community in particular. I want to share some thoughts with you today about why the 70s and the activism of the 70s mattered. Mattered both for understanding how we got to today, but also understanding how we can change today. Even before we can talk about the 70s, though, I think it's really important to note that the abominable state of prison conditions in the United States meant that there had always been a rich tradition of prisoner resistance, particularly beginning right after the Civil War, but continuing every decade thereafter. Now, clearly, by the decade of the 1960s, resistance behind prison walls was growing more militant, more widespread, and determined. And we already know a lot of this story, but I want to suggest to you that most of what we know is the tip of the iceberg. This was a rebellion in every city of the nation. This was a rebellion that in many ways scholars have not fully connected in ways that they should to the civil rights struggle writ large. Indeed, probably one of the most important parts of the civil rights struggle writ large. And at no place was this more evident than what happens in the early 1970s at the Attica State Correctional Facility in upstate New York. And this is my work on this comes out of a book that I'm trying to pull together on the history of this rebellion. Now, like so many prisons in America at this time, and in no small part because the response to the freedom struggle playing out in the nation's city centers, the response to black claims on the nation as a whole in this decade was a legal crackdown. Attica had an overwhelmingly African American prison population, one that had experienced disproportionate hardships, significant abuse. But of course, refusing to accept such treatment meant speaking out all the time, and on September 9th, 1971, meant that over 1,200 men overtook the prison itself. Taking dozens of hostages as leverage, these men forced state officials to negotiate. And thanks to support from countless activists both in and outside of the prison, by September 11th, 1971, they had gotten the prison commissioner to agree, at least in principle, to about 28 of their 33 demands. Notably, however, despite the progress being made, this particular rebellion ended most horrifically. On September 13th, 1971, Governor Nelson Rockefeller stopped all negotiations and retook Attica by force, specifically by sending in over 600 state troopers armed to the teeth, who then proceeded to shoot literally thousands of bullets, many of which were intended for large game, many of which were outlawed by the Geneva Convention, into a 50 by 50 yard enclosure where inmates and hostages alike were contained. Now, ultimately, trooper and correction officer bullets killed 29 inmates and 10 hostages and severely wounded so many others that the National Guard medics and hospital staff, who were eventually allowed in to assist, found themselves horrified, overwhelmed, and woefully unprepared to deal with such carnage. Now, rather than accept this as the disaster that it was, the most remarkable thing occurred. Officials from the state of New York stood right outside of Attica's 30-foot walls, faced the media, and reported that something altogether different had happened. The hostages, they said, had all died because the inmates had slit their throats. Worse, they said, one guard had actually been castrated, and the inmate who did it had shoved that guard's testicles into his own mouth. Now, this official version of what had gone so wrong at Attica made the front page of literally every newspaper in the country, from the New York Times to the Los Angeles Times. And the damage done by this media coverage was incalculable and went a long way towards poisoning people's minds about prisoners, about the legitimacy of prison protest. Now, had the men who had suffered this trooper retaking any idea that the public was being told that they were the animals in D-Yard on the 13th, they would have been stunned. Not only had the troopers been the one to shoot thousands of bullets into a yard full of completely unarmed men, but even after they'd regained full control of the prison, these officers continued to harm the inmates in ways shocking. Indeed, well after they'd restored order in D-Yard, troopers spent hours forcing Attica's inmates with multiple, sometimes 6 and 7 gunshot wounds, shattered limbs, to crawl through jagged glass on their bellies into cell block A, once in there to run a gauntlet, and after that to be thrown naked, wounded, bleeding into empty cells in groups of 3 and 4 where they continued to be tortured for days. And ultimately, with no medical care, no attention to this disaster, the Attica brothers' deep lacerations, broken bones, and bullet wounds caused a lifetime of disability and injury for so many of them. Now, the thing is, this was not the story about Attica that most Americans knew. as one surviving hostage noted Riley as late as the year 2000, the public is still under the general misperception that the inmates killed the hostages. Now, in no small part, this had become Attica's history in mainstream America because no troopers were ever indicted, and incredulously instead, 62 inmates were indicted for what had happened at Attica. And again, once again, sending the nation the message very clear message about why Attica had gone down the way that it did. Now, of course, the black community, the nation's activist community writ large, anyone who lived with racism on a daily basis or the realities of stop and frisk as well as other law enforcement abuses never bought the state's line, and to them, Attica had a very different meaning. And for that reason, Attica had a dual legacy, always a very important dual legacy. Very clearly, one of Attica's legacies was an increase in state-level repression at a whole new and more intensely institutionalized level that, Michelle has dubbed the new Jim Crow. But we need to look at this. First of all, Attica seemed to show the state police and state officials that they could act with relative impunity against the prison population in general, against black freedom fighters in particular. They could just do this with impunity. And if they spun their actions in just a certain way, America would not only let it happen, but thank them for it. This was the context, I suggest to you, that corrections officers in, I don't know what's going on here, that corrections officers in Brazzaville, Texas, sicked dogs on inmates while white guards in turn kicked and stomped on them as they were forced to crawl across the floor. This was the context within which prison officials tried to eliminate education programs from prison because in their view such programs were dangerous militant makers. And this was the context, quite literally, for the birth of the supermax prison itself. Indeed, the first suggestion of the need for a supermax prison comes out of Attica, comes from the warden who has a proposal to build a quote-unquote maxi prison, and it was going to be a place where the most militant and most dangerous inmates, we should all be contained. And this sort of morphs over time and becomes the horror show of the supermax prisons today. Now, in short, the unity, the calm, the militant determination that the state witnessed at Attica had threatened it to its core. And just as it happened after the Civil War when white Southerners, terrified by the possibility of black freedom, turned to the criminal justice system to reassert their dominance, when state and federal officials feared power loss in the 60s and 70s, they too sought to regain control via the criminal justice system, by changing laws, by locking up greater and greater numbers of African Americans, and by making their confinement even more hellish. This took work, it took effort to turn a public so punitive so quickly. And it took energy, outright lies, such as those told at Attica, as well as PR campaigns designed to fuel fears and fan the flames of racial prejudice, to build such an enormous and so punitive a carceral state. And this was, of course, energy that they were all eager to expend. But inherent to the Attica uprising of 71 was another legacy, the legacy of determined resistance. In short, what scared the bejesus out of feds and state governments everywhere showed the people just what activism could accomplish. It was clear that even with the horrific oppression that the prisoners of this rebellion endured, they had succeeded in bringing serious reforms to prisons. Ultimately, they succeeded in having their day in court with the state. And that's why, even in the midst of this carceral moment today, it's important to always remember the serious and ever-present resistance against it. And this has been playing out, as many of us know, recently in Georgia, at Lucasville, at places where rebellion is an ever-present reminder that the carceral state is, in fact, fragile, that the carceral state is, in fact, always at risk and always being challenged. And so I just want to close by saying this story of resistance to this nation's racialized and deeply punitive conditions of confinement is a story that goes back, way, way back, at least to 1865 in the deadly convict leasing mines of the South. It jolted the carceral state in 1971 at Attica. It's continuing to make headlines in Georgia, in Ohio. It's a story that from this moment onward we must not only continue to listen to carefully, but also must help to write. Thank you.
It should be at the bottom.
Need hers to go away. You said yours was?
It's right there.
This one?
This one, the balloon, that one. Now, can we can start it, but is there, what's the light toggle?
The what?
Light toggle, projector toggle. The on-off switch. Never mind.
Okay, where does it say?
Just go to slideshow.
Okay, there you go. You do it.
Yep,
You're good.
I got
You're
it.
good. All right.
Okay. Well, in a perfect lecture setting, you wouldn't see this until I want you to. So please don't be distracted by it. This is the start of a substantive part of my 10-minute presentation. It's a pleasure to be here. This is really important, and I'm happy to be a part of it. Let me throw a little bit of a different kind of problem with prisoner rights, with the problem of mass incarceration into the conversation. And that is that middle-class whites and blacks in this country are a new kind of silent majority around the problem of mass incarceration. That in many ways they represent the political bulwark of legitimation of a system that punishes people who make bad decisions. And let me also suggest at the beginning that if we don't address that problem, rather than talking amongst ourselves and talking to those who self-select themselves into these conversations, then we will continue to see a system that advances into its fourth decade. That being said, we are still trapped by the politics of the era beginning in the 1970s. That hindsight and perspective are still distorted by the religiosity of punitive punishment, as we know the war on drugs. People believe what they want to believe in spite of the facts. Take, for example, a Tea Party poll in 2009. It would be easily overlooked in a public policy or social scientific measure of whether the Tea Party contained racist elements. I mean, why bother? But nevertheless, in that study, the question was asked if only, well, let me set up the study very quickly. In order to discern the racial attitudes of those who identify as supporters of the Tea Party, a series of questions were raised. So you have a group of people who identify as a Tea Party, a group of people who are opposed to it. The question was, in your opinion, do you think if black people acted like immigrants, embraced hard work and ambition, that they would be able to overcome societal disparities, to overcome their inequalities in America? The answer to that question among those who identified as the Tea Party was 88%. 88% of those in the Tea Party believe that with more hard work, like the immigrants, black people would be on equal footing. No Jim Crow, no mass incarceration, no inequality in America. But more telling, in my opinion, was that 56% of those who identified in opposition to the Tea Party also agreed with that statement. And to me, that's the silent majority that we are working against. That is the silent majority that is not in this room. They are the ones who have an unfailing faith in the justness of American racial democracy and indeed the criminal justice system. History, however, matters to working against this mentality. History offers us important clues to the ways in which moments in the past offered foreclosure, like those museums that Professor James talked about, that give us a sense that we overcame difficulties, that we rose to the triumph of overcoming mistakes in the past. Native American genocide is uniformly in this country recognized as one of the country's founding evils. The Holocaust of slavery, although subject to some debate in pockets of this country, is recognized, of course, at every level of government and in polite conversation as an evil that this country fortunately rid itself of. Concentration camps during the Japanese internment period, again, resulted in formal apologies and reparations. So in each of those instances, from the 17th century to the middle of the 20th century, we see the way in which historical moments of injustice can be uniformly embraced as lessons for how not to repeat the mistakes of the past. Therefore, if we only think of the history of mass incarceration at the moment of which it begins, we are trapped in the same terms of the debate, in the same murkiness of perspective, in the midst of a religion of tough on crime policies that is very difficult to break. I would argue that with a new history of racial criminalization, one that connects the dots to an earlier past, to the moment of our new Jim Crow, as Michelle Alexander describes, we can light the fuse of a new counterweapon against the technocracy of mass incarceration, the arsenal of those who use intellectual firepower, the tools of social scientific measures and discourse, those like James Q. Wilson in 1975 who wrote Thinking About Crime to Heather McDonald and Juan Williams today. Let me then offer James Q. Wilson as an example. In 1975, as a political scientist writing at the cusp of the moment of mass incarceration, the set of ideas that he proffered to those decision makers who would help legislate and make possible the war on drugs and mass incarceration. James Q. Wilson states, "The fact that blacks commit a disproportionate share of certain crimes," sound familiar? "And those who led those who speak for and about blacks in the 1960s either to deny the fact, that is, that we all know crime statistics are inaccurate," this was the counter argument, "to explain it as the result of a discriminatory police system," that is to say that black people are picked on, in the words of James Q. Wilson, "or to argue that blacks are driven into it by poverty and segregation. There is some truth in all of these points, but only some. Taken as a full account of the matter, they are seriously inadequate. Translation, crime statistics are reflections of criminal offending. Racial profiling and police misconduct are minor issues. And economic inequality was no excuse, or is no excuse, for participation in the underground economy." He continues, "A different perspective on crime, one easily available to a person," and this is my favorite part about this quote, "easily available to a person of reasonable sense who lived in the inner city was no matter who was committing crimes." I've messed up the quote. "The victims were disproportionately blacks. Police protection was inadequate, and more efficient deterrence and apprehension of systems was necessary." So since I butchered the quote, let me just paraphrase what he says. He says, anyone with reasonable sense, with a good head on the shoulders, can see that black people don't need social welfare. They need more police officers to protect them from the criminals within their own community. And on that basis, the silent majority could proceed with supporting the kind of policies that were enacted from that period forward. But here's the kicker. Wilson, nor any of those today or of that generation, were willing to concede that increased law enforcement, that punitive prison policies and policing measures were the only solution to the common sense of inner city black on black crime. And indeed, if we go back to the moment where the black crime problem, as we understand it in modern terms, begins, we find precisely the terms of the debate that have locked us into, for more than 100 years, this mentality, that the only way to deal with this, whether it's Bill Cosby, Juan Williams, or Heather McDonald, is to put more cops on the street. You see, the race-neutral statistical discourse, now you are free to look to the slide, was founded at the start of the postbellum period. Michelle Alexander teaches us in her work that
the very nature of what sustains, what gives the political support to our current war on drugs, in spite of all knowledge to the contrary, is this notion of color blindness. That if we arrived at a post-racial moment, and surely the system is not locked into a conspiracy of racism. Well, the first basis for arguing about the race neutrality of criminalizing black people was to use the trope, numbers speak for themselves. And the most significant number to emerge in this moment within a generation after the end of slavery was that nearly a third of the prison population was black, and it was only 12% of the population in the general country. Not much different than the statistic Brandon quoted at 38% earlier today. Our population, the general population, is precisely the same. So this tells us a little bit about the way in which the statistical reality of black people in prison and the numbers produced by that, the statistical study of it and the way in which we talk about this issue hasn't changed much since the very first time it entered into the national discourse. You see, the number and the trope number speaks for itself erases the political economy of racial criminalization, and in particular, Southern racial criminalization. That number was a direct consequence of the struggle for equality that African Americans engaged in the immediate aftermath of slavery. And the very systems of racial domination that emerged in that moment, from convict leasing to chain gangs to vigilante mob violence and lynching, helped to produce that actual statistical reality. And yet, in the national conversation, in the North and in the South, there were no asterisks, no caveats, few footnotes. The simple fact was that maybe the Southerners had gotten it right. Maybe black people weren't ready for freedom. And what's important about this, and what makes this not something trapped in the museum, what makes it not something trapped in the distant past, is that most of us who aren't in this room are still stumped by that reality. We may say 38% out of 12% is evidence of racial disparity, but most people, I would submit, say, well, black people must be doing something wrong. The rape myth is yet another example. I've already mentioned convict leasing, but it should demonstrate to this audience precisely the fact that what we know today to have been a profound mythology justifying inequality in that moment was indeed abetting the problem. Black people's self-defense over contestation and land ownership, the right to be paid fairly for their wages itself, produced violence between black men and white women, black men and white men, and white women and black women and white men, and yet self-defense was itself a racial privilege reserved only for white people in courts of law. High arrest rates in this time period, the earliest migrants out of the South after the Civil War, it turns out, were convicted in northern prisons at rates more than twice as much as Southern. And yet it was not understood to be a reflection of Northern racism because the North was colorblind. It was understood to be an actual unmitigated reflection of black people's pathology. Only in the South, only in that barbaric South, in the mind's eye of progressives and liberals, could racism help explain over-incarceration. And that was amongst a subset of the white North. That is, the myth of Southern exceptionalism and colorblind urban North ultimately fueled the idea that black people were exceptional as a race of criminals whose problems could not be explained away in society. And if we felt as if that were in and of itself part of the history lesson, we'd be mistaken. Because at precisely that same moment, extremely high rates by arrest statistics and prison rates, Native whites and European immigrants were creating tremendous social unrest outside of the South. And as we already know, the vast majority of those incarcerated up to the 1970s were white. So how do we explain then the road that would decriminalize and change and shift the conversation from over-offending European and white Americans to a singular focus on African Americans? And in my remaining time, I'm just going to fly through some of these ideas. The exceptional criminal in the North grows out of a direct linkage of African Americans in the North, not in the South, as people who have the opportunity to participate fully in the economy. In other words, it is a function of their bad decision making, their actual pathology that produces their inequality. And here, at the same time, European immigrants are understood to participate in criminal behavior by virtue of the economy. You see, at this moment, the comparison between the black migrant in the North and the European immigrant, subject to social Darwinist and eugenicist ideas about their innate inferiority, actually creates a new discourse of structural inequality that is applied to them. And so in this quote, one of the most important thinkers of this period notes that white immigrants are an army of unfortunates driven to madness, crime, or suicide, and that the solution is to address the political economy of the United States. Also simultaneously then marks the black person, in this case in the second quote, as someone whose criminality has roots elsewhere, and the solution is to neglect them. That's not all fully. I'm giving you more information that's in that quote. But the point is, this comparison, like the Tea Party poll today, was being made at the very beginning of the national discourse about black criminality. Finally, at the bottom, and I'll move from this, Du Bois is there ready with evidence and counter-argument to challenge and to resist this set of ideas. I'm not going to read these quotes. I'll only say that those of you who are the criminologists in the room knows that the social scientific literature of the early 1970s argued that no amount of prison programming and reform efforts actually reduce recidivism, and therefore nothing works. And so what can we do but incapacitate the prisoner? And I would argue that it's precisely in this moment that we begin to see the makings in the North dealing with a colorblind society where people rise and fall based on their own merits, where we see the same arguments appear. Here in the work of Hoffman, we see that he's basically repudiating education. The statistics of education show that opportunity is increasing, and yet crime is increasing. Now, Southerners go and run and do with that what they will, which is ultimately say that education actually creates criminality. In the double standard world of progressive era responses to white and European immigrant criminality, this is just an example of the structural origins of white criminality. What I'm arguing here produces a road to decriminalizing whiteness, to reducing the structural inequalities that are the preconditions for criminal behavior in any community, regardless of race. And here is the explicit language articulated. How are criminals made? So long as there are bad tenements, sweatshops, brutal policemen, bad jails, child labor, dishonest writing employers. This is their language, this is their articulation in the white inner city slums of Chicago, Philadelphia, New York at the beginning of the century. Jane Addams attacked juvenile delinquency in this moment, focused on white violence and prostitution. In this slide, we see Jane Addams articulating the structural origins, but also depathologizing whites. She used the language of a spirit of youth rather than the statistical discourse which had become wedded to black people. So we continue to talk about black people as a reflection of victims of society using statistics. Jane Addams could have done the same. She did not use statistics as a measure of their humanity. She used their humanity. She talked about them as young people. And she also argued here that personal responsibility or parental responsibility was not the solution to the problem. We certainly cannot expect the fathers and mothers who have come to the city from farms or who have immigrated from other lands to appreciate or rectify these dangers, nor could we expect the young people themselves to kill the cancer of modern city conditions. If Jane Addams was a Nobel Peace Prizing paragon of social work activism in the early 20th century, why is she not part of the conversation today dealing with the same problems in the same inner cities, in the same neighborhoods that were once the breeding grounds for criminalization in that time period? Back to Wilson. Wilson's person of reasonable sense in 1975 called for more efficient deterrence. I'm getting all kinds of stares, but you get the point. Hoffman is using a double standard. Jane Addams is practicing a double standard. And it is that double standard that, again, masks that black people are not getting access to the same kinds of intervention that will ultimately remove them. This is just a visual example. Here's a social settlement house in Philadelphia. These are young, poor, white kids who need their help, who are the focus of crime prevention, and this is how the same organization, Fringe Neighborhood Guild, look to the immediate right, characterizes black poverty, reinforces racial difference, and creates a double standard for what black people need, which in this case is big pieces of watermelon, and the kind of racialized focus on their impoverishment that does not produce the kind of compassion that was being directed towards European immigrant youth. And I'm not going to do this. We'll talk about it in Q&A. But these double standards end up being reinforced in a period of time in the 1920s during the prison rehabilitation moment that ultimately creates a set of ideas, as Rebecca McClellan calls, that white men should be perceived as manly citizens, that the prison project itself should be about building up people rather than tearing them down. And it is in this moment that we begin to see deliberately the withholding of opportunity within the northern prison from African Americans. This is an example of that. This is New York State black prisoner abuse case a year before Attica was built. This is an African-American prisoner writing in an editorial to the newspaper, and here he describes the discrimination that they're facing. But I love the last line. They are not allowed on the baseball team nor in the band, and yet here's Sing Sing's baseball team. An all-white reflection of the kind of recreational prison programming directed towards those future manly citizens that would put them on a pathway of opportunity. And so as a consequence of that, we see that this kind of criminalization would lead to, in the 1930s, increasing incarceration rates among African Americans. In the 1930s, the rate of incarceration increased threefold for blacks and decreased for whites. And so the long road to mass incarceration that we're focusing on today in the 1970s and more recent times, prison projects were limited projects, limited resources, limited beds. And so white men begin to move out of prison to create the possibility and space for blacks. And that, of course, then contributes to, at the end of my talk, it contributes to the way in which discriminatory policing becomes a gateway to incarceration, because it is through police actions that have been reinforced by a set of ideas that have decriminalized white immigrants versus African Americans that we create the possibility and the landscape in the urban communities of this country for African Americans to be over-incarcerated. Thank you very much.
The Q&A straight away now. We have microphones coming around, so if you have a question or a comment, please look for a microphone. Or you can start to raise your hand and someone will find you. So.
Good morning. Panel, the presentation was very enlightening. However, I had a question. I know we're at Princeton, but there seems to be an over academic analysis of the problem. I was just wondering, was there an attempt to maybe reach out to some more grassroots organizers like Eddie Ellis and some other people that are former, Mumia is definitely a good fill-in, but, in addition to the professors and experts and so forth and so on, I think it just brings a certain level of reality to it when it's not discussed in such an academic form. Was there, I guess there's more to the organizers, than really the panel per se.
I'm not one of the main organizers, so I don't know if Brandon, if you want to speak to this, we definitely are aware of the important movements happening at CUNY and want to integrate that into the conversation. In part, that's what this panel was about, right? Thinking of how that history of activism really shapes how we understand the crisis of punishment, the prison industrial complex today. But I think it's a very important point and one that we should keep in mind. I don't know if, Brandon, you want to say anything or also want to have questions for the rest of the panelists. But thank you.
If you don't mind?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so I think Sophia Elijah is here. She didn't make it. Ben Cheney? Oh, so sorry. there are a number of activists who tried to make it here to participate. And the question that you raise is really important, and it keeps getting raised over and over again. Just, again, my mea culpas, but in 98 we did the precursor to critical resistance, and an anthology came out, and when we mailed it into the prisons, the political prisoners wrote back, well, thanks for the book, but it's academics talking about our lives. And so that's a struggle that appears across the nation, I think, in terms of how we organize and who gets to tell the stories and how those stories are remembered.
So let me try to address that question, which we actually struggle with. Brandon, myself, Jennifer, and half the people in this row probably gave us suggestions at some point. One of the things that we realized early on is a one-day symposium was not enough. You wouldn't have any way of knowing this, but we're looking seriously at addressing different aspects of this issue with different kinds of groups of folks in dialogue, be a substantial part of our programming over the next couple of years. We have film series. We looked at trying to get the local prisons involved. We looked at trying to have this webcast into the prisons. We talked to some folks who do different kinds of prison activism, but in trying to come up with an intellectual fit for a beginning of a conversation, very often what happens is the lens, I think, a lot of times what happens is the lens of academic work, of the scholarly work that helps to contextualize, to deepen our hope. You can see how going back to 1896 up to 1930 to 1970 is providing a backdrop that should be useful in talking about today. We thought, being an academic unit, that it would be good to start this project with that kind of lens, with that kind of focus, not by saying, we do have somebody from the Sentencing Project on the second panel, I do want to say, but not as the only way for talking about this issue, but as a way to begin it, and to begin a longer engagement, we believe. So we welcome any suggestions you would have about who we can invite to do this better.
Okay, my name is Carl Dix. I represent the Revolutionary Communist Party. I'm also a co-founder of the October 22nd Coalition to Stop Police Brutality, Repression, and the Criminalization of a Generation. Okay, give it some props, it deserved it. I was involved in that because we saw the reality of racial profiling and the fact that this generation of youth were being treated to a future of deprivation, poverty, and prisons, and that needed to be fought. Now, coming from that perspective, I welcome this scholarship because we need scholars digging into this to bring to us a historical and current day perspective of what the reality has been, how it links to today, to arm us with some facts that we can then fashion a case to say to people, this system, this is what my t-shirt says, this system has no future for the youth. The revolution certainly does. And that's my message, but I take some of this scholarship and run it through that revolutionary perspective. Because look, black people were drawn here by capitalism and the need for labor in the plantations. They were drawn from the South to the factories across the country when those factories required the labor of black people to help build up the wealth and power of the system. What we're dealing with today is that in its chase after profits, capital is sending them factories all over the world. What about those black youth in the urban areas? No future. And then that's when we see the war on drugs. Drugs flooding the ghetto and cops coming behind them to bust the youth who get caught up in that. The continued discrimination in the criminal justice system. That's the reality that we're dealing with. The other part of it, though, is it don't have to stay this way. That's the part about the revolution certainly does, because there's a way out of this, and that is through revolution, getting out from under capitalism, and there's a leader for that. And I gave some people a card on a celebration of revolution and the vision of a new world. I would encourage everybody to get one of those and check that out. Also check out the website for for Revolution newspaper, where we have some of this history linked to the current day, and a special issue on the oppression of black people, the crimes of this system, and the revolution that we need. But let's keep this discussion going, and let's go into these other areas, because this should be a point of national scandal, and it will only become that if those of us who are interested in it take it up and spread it. And that's the point. We got to draw this, but then spread it. And I would also encourage people to engage my point about the revolution certainly does, and check out that revolution. Thank you.
Hello. Hi, my name is Daryl McKell Brooks. I'm out of Trenton, New Jersey. I'm also an activist. I also did 3.5 years for a crime I didn't do. Came out, ran for U.S. Senate twice, came in 3rd place in New Jersey in 2008. And I'm also head of the Greater Trenton Tea Party. And that's amazing. and what bothers me is what I see about what's going on around the country. Yes, New Jersey, for instance, 10,000 kids locked up, 8,000 African American kids, 39,000 people are locked up, 80% African American. And what I see as a big problem is that I know history. Martin Luther King in the 60s movement, they protested, they shut things down. When are we going to side, the intellectual leaders, all through the 80s and 90s, this was happening. None of the black rebel or political leaders, activists said nothing about it, did not organize against this, allowed it to happen. When are we going to decide to say we're going to have to shut things down? That's what Martin Luther King did, nonviolent civil disobedience, direct action. That is not talked about around the intellect or any other, the real leaders talking about that. When go to the governor and say, listen, if you don't change your policies, then we're going to shut you down. It has to happen. When are we going to look at that view? And the panel can answer that question. Is that even in the thinking of the intellect of, if this were happening to Jewish kids or white children, what would they do about it? I mean, you have to really answer that question. Why are we allowing this to happen? And do we look at Martin Luther King in the 60s and 60s movement that shut things down, that protested? And we got to know history. So, thank you.
And this is something that we know everybody is very passionate about, but we are looking for specific questions to our panel.
Well, yeah, I'd like to say a few things. There's a lot of forces involved with your question in terms of why there's no mass uprising, but it's a different thing to say that there are not people on the ground every day working on these issues. You're working on issues. I know what's going on in Philadelphia. Folks are rumbling around these issues, and it's replicated all across the country. But I think one of the elements that gets kind of lost in this is the inertia of the political and economic system. Either people working to just survive every day, or the forces that are against us. I mean, people don't believe that something is happening unless they see it on the TV or in the newspaper. So what does the TV and the newspaper do? They just ignore it. And then people say, oh, well, that's nothing that's going on. And the people are standing out there saying, my goodness, I have a protest sign in front of your newspaper complaining that you're not covering it. So, things are happening. They're not happening to the degree that you want. And arguably and factually, they're not happening to the degree that they need to. But I think we make a mistake by saying nothing's happening when in fact it is, but it needs to, grow up a little more.
I just want to echo one. This is a simple formulation, but you can't start with King as the exemplar of grassroots activism, because at least 3 generations of black people whose names most of us don't know were trying to mount the same challenges to Jim Crow before it was official and long after it had come into play. So, in a sense, we are in the dark days of this new caste system, and it required all sorts of allies, those who were like Du Bois, those who were like Ida B. Wells, who was traveling around the world to bring attention to racial violence. So I wouldn't discount, as Lynn has pointed out, what is happening. It does mean, and I take your point validly, that we have to make sure that we're building the coalitions and the bridges and that we aren't dividing ourselves in terms of this collective goal. So.
Hi, my name is Robin McGinty, and first I need to say that I am formerly incarcerated. So I just want to pick up on what the gentleman was saying about a more inclusive discourse and how do we broaden the discourse. And I think, and I do have a question in a few seconds. Okay. So, you know, it's really interesting, and I'm just so happy that we are having this conversation, because one of the things, when I first saw Michelle on Bill Moyers several years back, it was just sort of like that epiphany, you know, that moment of epiphany, and that we can engage in this this conversation. But again, one of the things that I find missing is, you know, the idea of the alternate narrative of reentry, you know, serial displacement, of reintegration, resettlement, and that sort of thing. You know, history has its place. History is also lived, but the idea of the authenticity of the lived and being informed by the lived experience. So you guys probably made a great effort, but I serve as a chairperson of the CUNY Reentry Committee at CUNY. So, you know, and how do we begin to reframe reentry as education? And I think you talked about the disinvestment of those social and institutions such as education, this sort of thing. So I think my question again, and as I said, I'm sure you did a marvelous job, but again, it's sort of, it doesn't delegitimize what we're talking about, but like he said, Eddie's a very close friend of mine. There are folks that you can reach out to who are not necessarily, you know, when we begin to talk about academia, you know, that involves sort of like a separation, because you talked about the idea of the collective struggle and how we're all impacted by this. So one of the things I would like to know, again, how do we begin to talk about reentry?
Just on that, I think if anyone wants to answer that, that would be great, but that's definitely going to be one of the topics. We have people who are experts in that policy conversation on the second panel as well, so maybe we want to just keep that in mind for the second panel and be sure to address that. I don't know if anyone does want to speak directly to that. Otherwise, you know, we can have another question.
I might just say one thing.
Sure.
It's actually not about reentry. I think people will have more to say about it. But it's about having an academic conversation and who's included and who's not included and how these conversations come to be. I guess you know, part of the thing I was trying to. Okay. Is that better? All right. So in response to these multiple issues about an academic conversation, who's included, who's not, and what's the relationship between an academic conversation and the academy and activism, the academy and the experience of those who have lived and died within these institutions. These are very difficult questions. I guess I just felt that I wanted to say a couple of things. One is that this panel is only one part of a very broad conversation that's ongoing. Many of us who are on this panel have multiple relations with multiple people who are involved in this struggle across many different institutions. I mean, here we are in an institution of higher learning, and this is more or less an academic event. But the other thing I wanted to say about it was just that it took a great deal of struggle in order for these things to become the topic of academic conversation. Right? So part of what I closed my talk by trying to address is what is really to me a very painful sense of antagonism or estrangement between people who care about these things, right? So my hope would be that an event like this can be a moment of building bridges, reinforcing coalitions, and so on. The sites where we are seeing real activism, real mobilization right now, in this moment, among them are around institutions of education. Look what's going on in Wisconsin. I mean, those people are in the street, you know? And there's a long history of those kinds of collaboration. So it's just to say, so that's a history that matters too.
These issues that are being raised are very important about the inclusion or seeming exclusion, but let's try to step back for a minute. Your ability to articulate to people, say policymakers, about these issues, and they're going to say, well, this person from Penn or this person from Harvard said this and that. Well, you can now say, based on this forum today, well, at Princeton University, there was this issue talked about mass incarceration. So having these sorts of forums, irrespective of who's here and who's not, does give an imprimatur to the issue. And I work as a journalist. I've covered these kind of issues for like 35 years, and I could say, well, you may not see the fallout at 6 p.m. today from what you hear this morning, on the afternoon panel and in the keynote addresses. It will have a ripple effect, and you could seize on those moments to help build, the momentum that you want. And no one here, each one of the presentations you heard these scholars talking about how other scholars were wrong and trying to make that corrective action. So this information can be packaged and utilized, be it in Trenton or where you are in New York City, and it's just an ongoing part of the struggle. And if we look at it as a luta continua, then we have it from a different perspective.
And one thing that kind of comes to mind, riffing off of this, is that we may need new forms of the Underground Railroad in terms of how to communicate narratives that don't get heard. And so whether that's digital culture, whether, like at UT Austin, they have the Harriet Tubman Literary Circle, which is trying to focus on anti-Black racism, but also link it to political struggles to resist that. And you're talking about CUNY. I mean, there are initiatives all over. I think part of the problem, at least for me, is that I don't always hear about the various initiatives, and so it's difficult to learn from them. I just want to take a minute. It's not even a minute. But the Southern University Law Review, this came out a couple years ago, and there are probably, the numbers vary, but there are political prisoners in the United States today. And this is from Sundiata Acoli, who was in the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army. And he wrote this essay, which, this is an academic venue, right, put forward. And here's his definition. A political prisoner is a person held in confinement because of their beliefs, views, color, image, proclamations, associations, or actions related to the government of society. The operative word is government. It instructs that the PP is held for political reasons, matters related to government, rather than matters related to law. The word held is also instructive. The PP may have been detained for some real or contrived matter of law, but is currently held solely for political reasons. And I think in our organizing, the presence of these radical voices that are supposed to be disappeared in silence also have to come up, and that, the academic site is one way, digital sites are others, but there are a lot of ideas that people have.
So I think we maybe have time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Salah Hawkins. I serve with City of Greater Philadelphia on the First Trust Bank team at West Philadelphia High School. I just wanted to applaud all of you guys for some of the information you put forth today. I thought it was really amazing and I got a lot out of it. My question is directed more to Dr. Smith and Dr. Muhammad. You guys made great points about how there's a silent majority and how this issue with incarceration dates all the way back to slavery, even to some studies where Thomas Jefferson was saying that that we have the wolf by the horns, by the ears, and so that they need to separate the two. So I think a big thing is the separation between that was created with the Irish slaves and the African American slaves, to where that became an issue of separating people that were in kind of the same place, to now where we have the silent majority of people that are both suffering from kind of the same issues, but it's looked at two different ways. So what are you guys what are some ideas that you guys have to kind of educate people on? This is something that was created, so let's try to come up with some ways that we can combat that.
Do you want to start?
So I'm obviously committed to education. So forums like this are critical. I'm someone who believes in going to where people are most in need. So it's not just the college classroom, it's not just a campus address, but it's churches, it's schools, it's wherever I'm welcome. And it may sound old-fashioned, but knowledge is power. The problem is that neoconservatives over the past 40 years have spent a lot of time figuring out how to win the war of ideas. And we think that we have moral authority on our side, but moral authority is not enough to change the political economy of punishment in this country. I mean, we could argue that the president and the attorney general believe in the morality of justice, but they are not willing to stand up against the politics of punishment in this country enough to change the fortunes of black and brown people. So I think you have to be committed to forcing people to look you in the eye, and if nothing else, concede that they're not willing to do what they can do, which for me personally is very important, which is why I spent a couple of years at a criminal justice reform agency, Vera Institute of Justice, and these are people who are at the table. They're not just at the table like this, they're at the table of state legislatures. They are consultants to state legislatures, to Congress people, and they're skittish about racism. They're skittish. It's not that they don't know any better. They haven't figured out the language to make a point about the world we actually live in that is politically palatable, that is acceptable, that can be embraced. And so I spend a lot of time trying to craft that language, try to give people the kind of story. So if someone goes into another meeting and says, well, you know, Jane Addams was committed to saving poor white kids who were blowing each other's brains out on the streets of Chicago, not by locking up the ones who pulled the trigger, by making sure the circumstances of their lives were more improved, then I think people say, okay, well, I didn't know that. I never heard about that before. And then they say, well, what's that have to do with today? And then you fill in the blanks, right? Because that's the challenge that we have as educators.
Yeah, I mean, one part. You good? Are you good? One part of it has to do with what we do in the classroom, what counts as knowledge, right? Whose stories get told, what histories get remembered. Another part, I mean, I think Khalil makes a really interesting point about provoking the people who build these institutions to explain what they're about, right? And so I wrote a piece for a local New Haven activist paper called the New Haven Advocate about two men, George Gould and Ronald Taylor, who were wrongfully convicted 14 years ago, and tried to think about the way that for 200 years of imprisonment in the United States, the penitentiary have been swinging back and forth between two ways of justifying punishment in relationship to theories of justice. On one hand, punishment should reform the people who are incarcerated. On the other hand, punishment should be a kind of vengeful suffering inflicted on those who are incarcerated. And in some ways, I began to wonder as I thought about this particular case, if that whole conversation, whether you were on one side of it or the other, has begun to just drop away, and we now have this sprawling system that seems to be expanding according almost to its own logic, and that does not even step into the public sphere to explain itself and on many occasions in terms of one theory of justice or another. That provocation as well, I think, could be part of what we do as scholars.
Oh. Okay, so we're going to break now for lunch, and at 1:30 we will have the screening here, Acts of Art, so you can be back here at 1:30. Labyrinth Books is in the lobby selling books from some of the authors here as well as other relevant authors, and we also have an information table around. Oh, there are places for lunch at the back of your program as well. There's lists of restaurants.